What is poppin' YouTube? Today we're doing my must start, must sit wide receivers for week 7 fantasy football. We're going to be doing it in the tier format so you know how I view these players in each tier. So hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you're new, and let's go. So based on this week, the S tier is going to be Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp. The thing that we need to know about this week with the buys, with everything, it is a little depressing when you're setting these lineups. So, of course, you're going to be starting the studs. I have Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill in this top tier. We don't need to go into why I have them in the top tier, but just know I think they have the highest potential on fantasy points per game. You're starting both these guys. If you have moving on to the A tier, we have A.J. Brown, Keenan Allen, Stefon Diggs, Amon, St. Brown. The big things that I want to talk through with this tier is when we're talking about A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown's going up against the Miami Dolphins. So we're doing the Dolphins versus the Eagles. We think this is going to be a pretty high scoring game. A.J. Brown has been averaging 16.7 fantasy points per game in half PPR. So we absolutely love AJ Brown in this A tier. Then we move on to Keenan Allen, who's going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. 20.7 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. Keenan Allen, locked and loaded, wide receiver 1 starter. Shout out if you have Keenan Allen, maybe another one of these top guys. Keenan Allen's been absolutely balling for you. Him and Justin Herbert. I know there's the questions about this Chargers team, but Keenan Allen's balling in fantasy. Then we move to Stefon Diggs, who's going up against the New England Patriots. Good old New England Patriots Buffalo showdown. 19.1 fantasy points per game is what Stefon Diggs has been averaging. I have him behind AJ Brown and Keenan Allen, but like I said, in this tier, you could be making the argument for any of these guys. And then we move to Amon St. Brown, which Jared Goff just got put on questionable. So we don't know what Jared Goff's health is going to be. Of course, if Jared Goff isn't able to go, like, you're still going to have to start Amon St. Brown. He just might be pushed down into our B tier. But we do like Amon St. Brown as they are going up against Baltimore. 16.2 fantasy points per game is what Amon St. Brown has been averaging. We move to our B tier where we have Davante Adams, Chris Olave, Jaylen Waddle, Puka Nacua, and Brandon Aiyuk. When we're starting with Davante Adams going up against Chicago, 14.1 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. There's all those questions about last week where Davante Adams has been a little bit unhappy with his role. So we'll see if they come out and they specifically start to target Davante Adams a lot more. Because even if Davante Adams is double covered, you know who you're throwing the ball to. Davante Adams. Moving to our second player in this B tier, we got Chris Olave going up against Jacksonville. Chris Olave, 10.6 fantasy points is what he's been averaging. And I know there's been a lot of questions the last few weeks about, do I start Chris Olave each and every week over some of these other guys, because he really hasn't emerged as what you were hoping you were getting when you're drafting him in the late second round, early third round of your redraft leagues. But Chris Olave this week, like I said, Chris Olave this week is going to be my wide receiver 8. And so I am starting Chris Olave, feeling good about it. Then moving on to my wide receiver 9, we have Jaylen Waddle going up against Philadelphia with no Devon, with it still being the Raheem Mostert show in the backfield. We are assuming that these targets are going to have to start getting funneled a little bit more. I mean, of course, Tyreek Hill's been the main star of the show, but Jaylen Waddle, who did get his first touchdown this last week, we love some Jaylen Waddle. So I think if you have to start Jaylen Waddle, especially in a week where there's a ton of buys and there's everything like that, you should feel good about it. I have him in my top 10 wide receivers, and you should too. Love some Jaylen Waddle this week. We then move to our next player, which is going to be Puka Nacua versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. 16.2 fantasy points per game is what Mr. Puka has been averaging. A lot of people have been worried about him and Cooper Kupp. How are they going to coexist? Puka Nacua is literally just Robert Woods 2 seasons ago. Or Puka Nacua, okay, maybe that top wide receiver 1 upside is no longer there. But let's be clear, you got him off waivers. He is still a wide receiver 1 on a week in and week out basis, which is a league winning for what you got him for. So Puka Nacua here versus Pittsburgh. We like him as our wide receiver 10, 16.2 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. Then we move to our last guy in this tier, which is going to be Mr. Brandon Aiyuk. Going up against Minnesota, 14 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. You can make the debate that Brandon Aiyuk should maybe go ahead of Jaylen Waddle, should go ahead of Puka, because maybe his upside's been a little bit more prevalent week in and week out. I just like these matchups for Jaylen Waddle, for Puka Nacua, just a little bit more than Brandon Aiyuk this week. So that is why I give them the slight advantage. But as always, you could make the debate that Brandon Aiyuk should be above Jaylen Waddle and Puka Nacua. Just depends on your flavor, and that is my flavor. We move to our C tier, and I have DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, Devonta Smith, Michael Pittman Jr. DK Metcalf is going up against Arizona. 11.3 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. We then move on to Mikey Boy Evans, 13.7 fantasy points per game. You might be feeling a little dire about how Mike Evans performed last week and be saying, well, Caleb, Mike Evans, ahead of Devonta Smith, ahead of Michael Pittman, ahead of some of these guys in our D tier. Like, that's a little aggressive. I know it's a little aggressive, but I feel a bounce back game versus Atlanta. It's an division game. There's no Marshawn Lattimore across from Mike Evans. This is a matchup. This is a redemption game for Mike Evans. So I will be starting Mike Evans here in my C tier. We then move to our next 2 guys. Devonta Smith. A lot of questions have arose about Devonta Smith, and I know he is slightly injured. So if Devonta Smith, of course, doesn't play, then Devonta Smith should not be starting in your lineup. But if he does play, I do have him here in my C tier. I do have him ahead of Michael Pittman Jr. 9.9 fantasy points per game is what he's been averaging. Not good. Not good at all. But he's part of this Philadelphia Eagles offense. Devonta Smith is a super talented wide receiver. And so at this point, you kind of have to just base it off of the offense, based on the volume that he really hasn't been seen, but you see where it could be in the offense. And when you look at some guys behind him, you just really can't make the argument that you should be starting him over Devonta Smith. So Devonta Smith, you drafted him. You're going to have to continue to ride it out as much as it stinks. Devonta Smith is here in our sheet tier. Then Michael Pittman with no A-Rich for the rest of the season versus Cleveland, 11.4 fantasy points. Puts him here in our sheet tier. We then move to our D tier where we have Jordan Addison, DJ Moore, Hollywood Brown, Christian Watson, Zay Flowers, and Amari Cooper. Starting off with Jordan Addison, 10.5 fantasy points, going up against San Francisco. This defense has been absolutely electric for San Francisco. So Vikings running attack will be non-existent. It's pretty much been non-existent all season. But Jordan Addison will be getting a ton of targets. How are those targets? Will they look good? Are they going to be able to score? I don't know. But I think a volume play here for Jordan Addison against San Francisco is needed. Have him here starting off our D tier. Then we move to DJ Moore. No Justin Fields this week. 17.4 fantasy points is what he's been averaging. Of course, 2 weeks ago against the Commanders is kind of what is bolstering DJ Moore's fantasy points per game value. We got the backup quarterback in this week. I still feel like you have to play him because he's one of the best options in the Chicago Bears offense. He's going to get the volume, but are those targets good? I don't think so. That's why I have him more as a wide receiver too. But this is typical DJ Moore territory because he is accustomed to the targets not looking too good for my man. We then move to Hollywood Brown versus Seattle, 11.5 fantasy points. Christian Watson, Zay Flowers, and then Amari Cooper versus Indianapolis. Is Deshaun Watson going to play? Is it going to be PJ Washington again? I don't know. Amari Cooper still looks good with PJ Washington, so I'm not scared for Amari Cooper this week in the D tier. We move on to our E tier, and we start off with Calvin Ridley versus New Orleans and Christian Kirk versus New Orleans. Both of them are averaging 10.4 and 11 fantasy points per game. So it kind of just has, up to this point, has kind of been whose game is it going to be on that given week? Is Christian Kirk going to get the volume? Is Calvin Ridley going to get the volume? Based on how we've been seeing the last few weeks, Christian Kirk is looking like a better steal in the draft of where you drafted him compared to Calvin Ridley, but it's hard to say because Calvin Ridley has definitely been getting a little bit more double coverage on his side of the ball. We like them both here in the E tier. I wish I could put Calvin Ridley higher, but based on recent events, based on his fantasy points and his performances, Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk, they're kind of head-to-head. So got them both here in my ear tier. We then moved to Jacoby Myers. Mr. Jacoby ended up being someone that we were looking to sell this week just based off some of his performances. People are saying that he's a super talented wide receiver, which I'm not disagreeing. I just would sell him if I could. But if you have to play him, he's going up against Chicago, 14.5 fantasy points per game. Jimmy G seems to like targeting Jacoby Myers a lot more than Davante Adams. I don't know if that's because of the double coverage. And Jacoby Myers one-on-one instant win. So Jacoby Myers is here in our E tier. And then we finished that off with Chris Godwin. 9.7 fantasy points per game is what Chris Godwin has averaged this season versus Atlanta Falcons this week. I know there's been weeks where Chris Godwin has performed better than Mike Evans. So why do I have Chris Godwin and Mike Evans so far apart when in recent weeks it was a lot closer? The main thing for me is Mike Evans' boom potential. I just feel like Chris Godwin doesn't have that same boom potential that Mike Evans does. So that's why I have him here as wide receiver 24. Not too low, but still not great. Then we are rounding out our tiers here with the F tier. We have Tyler Lockett, Drake London, Gabe Davis, Diontae Johnson, George Pickens. Mr. Tyler Lockett, 10.1 fantasy points per game, going up against Arizona. Great matchup for the Seahawks. We love that. Drake London, we felt like he was a sell earlier in the season. Maybe he was a buy low, and maybe we got that wrong. Drake London, 9.8 fantasy points per game. It's been pretty touchdown dependent, though, for Drake London, even though the target share has been good. Where will Drake London do this week against Tampa Bay? I don't know. But you're probably starting him if you have him in a flex. I don't love it, but I mean, he's been producing, so you almost have to ride the hot hand for Drake London. Then we move to Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis against New England, 11.1 fantasy points per game is what Mr. Gabe Davis has been averaging. We like that for Gabe Davis. And then rounding out our wide receivers, we got Diontae Johnson and George Pickens. Couldn't really pick between the two. It was all off-season debate. Are you drafting George Pickens? Are you drafting Diontae Johnson? George Pickens has looked pretty good as the alpha here recently, but with Diontae Johnson coming back into the fold, what are those target splits going to look like? Is Diontae Johnson even going to look healthy? Awesome questions. I like Diontae Johnson's target volume a lot more than George Pickens. So if they're both having to compete against each other, I like Diontae Johnson just a little bit more. But like I said, have them in the same tier. So you're probably starting both of them just based on the lack of depth at wide receiver this week with all the buys. So let me know down below if I can answer any start sit questions for you, if I can clarify anything for you. Appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll be back again with another video tomorrow. Happy to be back in the home studio, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.